Hello everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Kayla Sweeney. I am a second-year master's student here at U of L, and while my focus throughout my time in this program has primarily been creative writing and poetry, I have greatly enjoyed learning about and analyzing comics with you all this semester, and in particular, the deeper, more personally complex turns it can take, such as through graphic memoirs like Persepolis, or works such as Mouse. But this week, I am tasked with teaching Underwater Welder, which has definitely become one of my favorite novels that we've explored thus far this semester. So to begin with, I just want to talk a bit about the background of Underwater Welder and kind of attempt to situate it within the context of all the works that we've explored thus far this semester. So Underwater Welder was published in August of 2012 by Jeff Lemire, who, according to his website, is a New York Times bestselling author and the creator of graphic novels such as Sweet Tooth, Plutona, Black Hammer, and The Royal City. There are many genres or categories that are tempting to use when classifying this graphic novel, but after we closely examine and read through Underwater Welder, we're going to find that it's fairly hard to define it specifically in terms of its genre. When thinking about it in relation to other works we've read this semester, though, we can make several observations. First of all, it is similar to Mouse and Persepolis and Displacement in that it has some biographical elements that are tied to the life of the author, and that's something that we will discuss in just a little bit. One thing that I personally really enjoyed about this graphic novel is that it is fluid in its form of time and space. It doesn't move in a clear chronological pattern. There's a lot of flashbacks, and at times we're not really sure whether we are in the present or the past, or we are with Jack in a whole other world. And so that part of Underwater Welder is kind of similar to Displacement, as we saw last week in watching the characters move through time and through memory, and then also with Watchmen, specifically with the character of Dr. Manhattan throughout the course of that novel. So yes, it's similar to that in that it moves through history and memory in a way that's not quite definable for us as the reader. However, the novel also stands apart in its uniqueness as a genre. In fact, when an interviewer directly asked Jeff Lemire, whether the book was a horror, a sci-fi, or a fantasy, or something else, he said the following: "There are genre elements to it, I guess, but it's really not a genre book. It's not a horror book or a sci-fi book at all. It's a drama, and I don't know how else you classify it. It's highly personal. It's a highly personal work for me. So it's hard for me to call it a sci-fi book or a horror book." So, he shares later in the same interview that he was actually around the same age as Jack, the main character, when he wrote the novel, and he himself was expecting a child at the time. So despite its lack of a label outside of just a drama, we can't deny that this novel is very otherworldly in its elements. So, to shortly summarize the novel itself, Underwater Welder centers around Jack, who, as he repeats several times throughout the tale, is a 33-year-old underwater welder who is about to become a father. In Jack's days leading up to becoming a father, he is reminded of his own father, who died on a Halloween night when he was young, and goes through a complex journey to both deal with the trauma of that death and the unanswered questions surrounding his past. Additionally, he's dealing with the coming responsibilities of being a father himself. And so we have this emotional journey, but this emotional journey doesn't just take place seemingly in Jack himself, inside of him, but it seems like it takes place through, quote unquote, a strange experience, one that even we as the readers, when we finish the novel, can't fully explain. So Jack finds a pocket watch in the depths of the ocean when he's working, that his father gave him when he was young, and we see him transferred to a world where he is completely alone. And this is an experience that in the book he says he's been longing for a very long time. He then faces his past and he specifically faces the end of the life of his father in a way that he couldn't do or deal with in his daily life, which as you read the book, you'll see Jack sometimes seems to view his life as frustrating or mundane, or he has a sense of discontentment with it, even though he loves his job. And so this journey seems to allow Jack to deal with this pain, to deal with these questions in a way that he can't normally do in his life. So this episode in the water is very mysterious to us as the readers. And as you explore the novel this week, something you might consider is, did this strange experience physically happen to Jack, or was it actually just in his mind? It's presented to us as kind of being something otherworldly, but as you analyze the novel, that's something for you to consider. The boundaries of time and space, of reality and fiction, are definitely blurred in this story. But this may lead us all to different conclusions, and we're not really given a direct answer about that. So we can just look at the choices and the storytelling and the structure and the artistry of the book to make our own assumptions or conclusions about that. Something to consider, additionally, as you read, is that whole old high school English question of what is the main conflict in this novel. So when I used to teach high school English, we always talked about the different kinds of literary conflicts. You have man versus man, or man versus self, man versus beast, man versus machine. So if we look at Underwater Welder as man versus self, Jack is dealing with the own pain inside of him from different things in his past. Additionally, he's dealing with the fear of the future. We can see that it might start there, but that it goes so much deeper than this broad category. We watch Jack wrestle with his fatherhood. We watch him deal with that unhealed trauma of losing his father at a young age, and also just the tumultuous relationship he had with him and that his father had with his wife when he was alive. We see him struggle with the inability to meet the expectations of his wife, and then also just his discontent in life in general. So just something to consider is, how does this conflict drive the story? How does it shape the story? And then how did it impact the author's decisions in forming the story? So I also, secondly, want to talk about just some of the unique elements in Underwater Welder, particularly with the artistry of the book, or the way, like the images of the book and the way that it is structured and formed. So from the very beginning, this comic is artistically very unique in its style. Although, of course, I'm not an expert on comics. I've not read all there is to read. But if we look at the different things we've read this semester, I would say that Underwater Welder is pretty unique. On this opening page, we see that even the ISBN number, the editing information, and the publishing information are written here, and they're presented as trickling down underneath the surface of a body of water, which of course is super important in this book. So this manipulation of letters, as shown on this page, is something that Lemire will continue to use throughout the course of the story. He does this in different fashions, sometimes using large handwritten letters paired with images, or causing words to stand starkly alone on a blank page. On this next panel, we see this method used again. This time it's kind of giving life to the music that's coming from the car radio, and it's shown it shows it rising up to Jack's father as he smokes inside of his truck. Likewise, we also see another method here. I call this kind of a expression fragmentation is the way that I think about it. You'll notice in the boxes in the middle, we see in the review mirror the eyes, but then under in the panel below, we watch him smoking. And, those are subtle parts of his expression, but the fact of it being kind of spaced across all these different panels gives it a kind of power that I think it wouldn't have if it were just in one picture. So this is going to reappear at other points in the novel. And like I just said, I think this does something for the characters' emotions. And I think our author is choosing to express these emotions in a way that's a little less traditional than you'll see in some comics. So here you see Jack visiting his mother after his quote-unquote experience in the water, to the day after when he's, supposed to go see his mother before going to the appointment with his wife. And we see his mother's words in the right corner. It says, "Don't worry, Jack. I'm sure everything will be just fine." But much more space on the page is given to Jack's expressions. And again, they're fragmented over nearly half the page. I didn't put the whole page here because I wanted you to be able to see this image a little more clearly. But this concept is something that you might choose to discuss in your post this week. So I don't want to dive into it too much, at least on my own thoughts on why the author chose to do this. But I think it's something to watch out for because he does this several times, this fragmenting of expressions. And then speaking of expressions, the last unique aspect from Underwater Welder I would like to talk about is the way he portrays general facial expressions in normal panels. So like any form of portrait drawing or portrait art, an artist can make a person's expressions very grotesque or deeply expressive. So we saw that in Nat Turner, definitely with some of the characters and the pain they were experiencing. For example, when the enslaved people were being beaten or when murders were taking place, we definitely saw those grotesque, very extreme expressions. And then we also saw it in Watchmen with a lot of the violence in that scene and also some of the tender moments between some of the characters that was portrayed pretty, again, expressively through the facial expressions. That was a little redundant. But in Underwater Welder, we actually see a more subtle approach, I would argue. So I was very struck by this approach near the beginning of the novel. So this is when Jack and Susie are talking and they're eating at Seabreeze Diner. And in this scene, the couple is talking about some pretty difficult issues. So we have Susie discussing her concern about Jack's recent behavior. We have Jack discussing the anniversary of the death of his father. We have the couple talking about the coming of their child's birth. Then they move to other parts of the emotional spectrum and they start joking with each other affectionately at different points in this conversation. So we have this whole range of emotions happening on a couple of pages, and this is just one of them. Yet, for the most part, the characters' expressions on this page stay pretty similar, and they're pretty subtle. So if you look at Jack in the first, third, fifth, and then the final box, his expression is almost exactly the same. Now he's drinking coffee in the middle, so we can't quite see what he's doing. But his face pretty much stays the same. And the same could be said of Susie. And it's not just on this page. This is something you'll notice throughout the course of the novel. Another thing that you might notice is a lot of the characters look really similar. So even Jack and Susie, their facial structure is pretty similar. Jack's mother, in my opinion, looks extremely similar to Jack. And so it's interesting that the author is doing this because in some ways, as we've just talked about, expressions in this novel are painted in extreme manners, or the words of the novel or the structure of the page is used to paint a certain picture with these emotions. And yet when we look at the facial expressions themselves, sometimes they're more subtle. So that's just something for you to consider this week as you explore this novel. Finally, I'm not going to go into too much depth with this because I feel like it's pretty straightforward, and we've already talked about a synopsis of the novel, but this novel is broken apart into 4 sections or 4 chapters, and that moves from the beginning of the tale prior to the birth of Jack's child, Jack and Susie's child. Then, we move slowly throughout the book into Jack's experience, his strange experience in the water, both before he goes to the doctor and sees his mother and then after. And then finally, at the end of the book, he's about to return to his family. So that is what happens throughout the course of this novel. I'm really excited to talk with you about this week, and I hope you enjoy Underwater Welder. Thank you all.